Starting. All right. Welcome to our live stream. We'll give this a moment for people to check in. In the interim, I'm just putting in the chat. Oh, I was going to put some resources in the chat, and it says it's too many words. Let me try cutting down. All right, I put some resources in the chat. I'll add more later, and there'll be more in the description later. So welcome to everyone who is joining us for this live stream of Intro to War Tax Resistance, otherwise known as War Tax Resistance 101. My name is Lincoln Rice. I'm the coordinator of Newtric, and I'm joined tonight by Chrissy, and she's a Newtric's outreach consultant, and I'll let her introduce herself.
It's great to see people showing up and to be here with everyone tonight. I just wanted to introduce myself, Chrissy Kirchhoffer, outreach consultant for the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, which we often say Newtric, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat tonight to relay some of that back to Lincoln. So looking forward to this time together with you all.
Thank you, Chrissy, and we'll get started momentarily, but yeah, as Chrissy stated, I have a slideshow for us to go through tonight, which might take up to 30 minutes, but Chrissy will be keeping an eye on the chat. So if there's any questions about anything in the slideshow or even anything that's not in the slideshow, feel free to put that in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can afterward. But I will begin by sharing my screen. All right. So yeah, the presentation here, we won't pay war tax resistance and resisting U.S. militarism. So again, my name's Lincoln. I'm with the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. We also go by the name Newtric, which is our acronym, and our website, which has just so many resources available for free, is always there for people to visit, nwtrcc.org. So some important disclaimers as we get started. So I'll start with some background information and then kind of move into some of the how-to of war tax resistance. But some of the methods of tax resistance are not legal, and anyone who attempts them should be prepared to face the risks of civil disobedience. So we'll be talking about which methods are legal and which methods are not, but some of the methods we'll be talking about will definitely be illegal. We'll also be talking about, explaining what is the actual law on certain matters, but then also in practice, what has actually been enforced, because those are often two different things. So while we'll be sharing that experience, just being aware that government laws and policies are subject to change. So our website, we always keep people up to date on those things. We view ourselves as war tax resistance counselors, people who have been practitioners of this, but are willing to, for free, just willing to share our information. But we're not trying to give tips on how to fudge, cheat, or for gimmicks. or to avoid taxes. It's more about a moral stance of wanting to not be participating in what we view as funds being used to cause harm. Normally, someone giving this presentation might say I'm not an accountant. My undergrad actually is in accounting, so I am an accountant, or at least that's my background, but I'm not a financial advisor or a lawyer, though many of our resources, we have worked with a lawyer over the last few decades to make sure that things are accurate, but I'm not here to give legal advice. But it's more meant to share our experience for others that are interested in trying to test out some of these things themselves. So what is NUTRIC, or the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee? We're a coalition of groups across the United States that has worked for over 40 years to support people who refuse to pay taxes for war and violence. So war tax resistance existed before that, but in 1982, a number of local groups from across the country wanted to have a place where an organization that could kind of be a place where these discussions could happen nationally. Why do we practice war tax resistance? Why are we talking about this tonight? We know that the United States spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined. So that little pie chart kind of shows all the global spending on militarism. The Pentagon has never passed an audit. I think someone just sent me an article in the last couple of days about them failing another audit. So there's questions about where all the money goes. Military tactics and weapons have come also home to local and state police departments through what we call the 1033 program. And I'm sure, as many folks know if they're joining us here, the United States is a huge supporter of the Israeli military financially. In addition to funds that will be additionally going to support the Israeli military on an annual basis, we've already been giving them over $3 billion a year in military aid. If we're looking more just at the United States and our federal income taxes, so this is a pie chart that's put out every year by the War Resisters League, though the National Priorities Project also puts out a similar type of puts out similar information. But we can see this is based on the budget that Biden put out earlier this year. In any given year, almost since the end of World War II, the current and past military spending has hovered between the mid 40s to around 50% of federal income taxes. So it's a huge portion of our budget. Continuing this, why do we resist? Some of it has to do with the military budget. For others, it's a combination of militarization of the border, US policy of deportations, federal prisons, militarization of police, the impact of war on the environment. Currently, the US military is the #1 institutional user of oil in the world, but climate agreements like the Paris Climate Accord exempt militaries from having to meet climate goals. So that's a huge blind spot in trying to address the climate crisis. There's also issues of torture and war crimes, including obviously the war in Gaza, which is being mostly orchestrated with US supplied weapons. And there's a photo on the right there also. This is from Lakeland, Florida, through the 1033 program, where local police departments can obtain for free or at low cost military grade weapons. That's a tank that they've received from the US military in order to use locally. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just some highlights of war tax resistance history. Essentially, if we have enough history about a civilization, it seems that we can find instances of war tax resistance. One of the earliest recorded instances on the North American continent goes back to the 17th century when an Algonquin tribe refused to pay taxes to build a Dutch fort. There's obviously other famous cases like Gandhi in 1930. More recently, for the past 2 to 3 years, millions of people in Myanmar, otherwise known as Burma, have been refusing to pay their utility bills. In 2021 is when the military coup happened there, and unlike in the United States, they've probably faced a far scarier situation with those who've refused to pay, in this case, utility bills that the military regime is using to fund itself, and it's led to instances, many instances of military with guns going into people's homes to demand utility payments. So, that's an instance of people using that as a tactic right now in another part of the world. When it comes to which method is right for you, that will be getting to some of these methods shortly. One of the either difficulties or benefits of war tax resistance is that, the difficulty someone might say is, well, taxes are complicated. There's not a cookie cutter method. On the plus side, someone could say, with war tax resistance, there's enough flexibility that I can choose a method that I'm comfortable with, that works for my personal situation. And so, depending on what's someone's goals, risk tolerances, what values they're trying to, put forward, their life situation, whether they're, dependents, in retirement, self-employed, all of those things come into play. So how to resist taxes. And so I'll just say here, we also have a picture on the right of these 5 individuals are considered the founders of modern war tax resistance in the United States. After World War II, many of them were resistors to militarism during World War II, but especially seeing the horror of nuclear weapons being used in Japan by the United States, and knowing that those weapons were only going to increase in number and size. They were kind of the leaders that inspired those who came to war tax resistance afterwards, especially during Vietnam and afterwards. But there are essentially kind of 2 basic methods that this would be kind of the illegal method, or the method of civil disobedience, that someone refuses to pay some or all of the income taxes that they owe, and then they either choose to file or not to file a tax return. And we'll get to that also, like why someone would choose to either file or not to file. The legal method would be to earn less than the taxable income. So if you're a single individual, right now, assuming you don't have any other deductions or tax credits, that'd be around $13,000. It doubles if you're married. And so the legal method would be to live more simply, which for some folks might also fall in line with their wanting to live more simply with the earth, consume less resources. So again, part of this depends on what someone's values are and what their living situation is. So if someone is an employee, so they're, if people are not retired, there's usually 2 ways that people make money. Either they're employees or they're self-employed. So if you're an employee, normally you will notice that federal income taxes are withheld from your paycheck. And, back in olden times, you may have gotten like a pay stub that showed this. Maybe you still get a paper pay stub, but there's a good chance you have to like go online and to see how much is being deducted in federal income taxes from your paycheck. That amount is determined when you fill out what's called the W-4 form, which you normally do either when you're initially hired or your first day of work. And we're not going to in this session go through how to, refill out a W-4 form, but there is a resource here. If one went to nutric.org, nwtrcc.org/W4, we have a short video, a little 2-page flyer, and then a small booklet that are all just available for download or to view online that go into this. But this W-4 form, essentially, there's a line called 4B where you can put your deductions, and what you put on that line for your deductions will determine how much is removed from your paycheck. So anyone can fill out a new W-4 and submit it anytime. And actually right now, for folks who might be considering war tax resistance, this is perhaps almost the perfect time to do it if you want to kind of test the waters. Because if you normally have most of your income taxes withheld most of the year, but this coming week turned in a new W-4 form, it only result in money for your last couple paychecks, lowering or eliminating the federal income taxes that would normally be removed. So maybe by the time April 15th rolls around, or if you file earlier, you still can make a decision at that point. Do I want to be a war tax resister, or will I just pay it on April 15th? So you still have the decision. And that's the good part about this, is it gives you time to really think about it. I will state that filling out what's considered a fraudulent or an unfaithful W-4 is a finable offense, and it could lead technically up to 1 year in prison. But the IRS hasn't enforced that law since 1975. Back in the early 70s, they were coming down on war tax resistors for changing their W-4s and filing inaccurate ones with their employers. But now that it's doing that seemed to just raise awareness of the method. So now they usually try to collect on the other end. So there hasn't been any punishment, so to speak, or enforcement of this rule since 1975, over 45 years. But essentially, this gives you time to decide when you file your taxes if you still want to be a war tax resister, if you feel comfortable with it. The other thing is, if you normally get a refund, if you even just filed an accurate W-4, because most people they get confused by the form and they don't fill it out accurately, and it leads to more money being taken out than there needs to be taken out. So if you filled it out accurately, which our video would at least give you a hint of how to do that, you would stop giving the federal government a zero interest loan to spend on war and violence during the year. So if you're self-employed, this means you're working as a contractor or a consultant or in the gig economy. If you're working for a corporation, you probably filled out a W-9 when you started work with a client. And this W-9 was essentially, you just put down your name, address, social security number, so that at the end of the year, they'll send a form to you letting you know what they paid you during the year. And then they also send it to the IRS. If you're the type of self-employed person who works mainly, like, let's say you're a carpenter and you just kind of take jobs for families that hear about you, well, they're not going to have you file a W-9, and essentially all the work you do is basically under the table, and the IRS is taking your word if you file your taxes on the honor system of how much you've made. So in this sense, you're responsible for paying or not paying all of your own taxes, including Social Security and Medicare. So the W-4 method before, it doesn't affect Social Security and Medicare. Those are already removed either way. So people who are self-employed also need to make the decision if they want to pay into Social Security or Medicare. Many folks choose just to pay the Social Security and Medicare and to refuse to pay the other portion, while some war tax resistors also refuse the Social Security and Medicare portion because almost every U.S. president during the last 4 decades has borrowed from it for the military when they've needed to. They've always had to pay it back, but it's kind of a fund that's there to help people out. For folks who are self-employed, again, right now you're in a situation where you're supposed to make 4 quarterly payments of your income taxes throughout the year, and the last one's on April 15th. So you could make a decision to either not pay that or underpay. And then again, when April 15th rolls around, you can think about, is this something I still really want to do? And you'll have the decision of whether you want to pay those taxes for war or not. So then we get to the issue of filing versus not filing. And so just to let folks know, after we kind of get through these basics, we're going to talk about, what are the risks and what could happen versus what would likely happen if you practiced war tax resistance. But just to touch on filing versus not filing first. So There are legitimate reasons that some folks file and others do not. If you file, you know that the IRS, especially if you are collectible, has accurate information, and if they do collect, it'll be the correct amount and not more than the correct amount. It also allows the opportunity for sending a letter of protest. It can make IRS collection easier because they know where you are. They probably know where you live. They know since you sent in the forms, they'll be able to confirm that you do owe this much. One reason that many people who file choose to do so is because there's a 10-year statute of limitations on collection. It starts once your income tax debt is assessed, and the IRS will assess it after they process your forms. So normally that's shortly after you file that your form would be processed and the tax debt assessed. That this 10-year statute of limitations begins, and after 10 years, the IRS can no longer use their civil arm to try to collect the money through wage garnishments or levies, or the criminal arm to criminally prosecute if they wanted to do so in a certain instance. Another reason that many folks file is it makes it easier to apply for scholarships, for student loans. The student loan folks, their preference is to verify income through tax forms. It doesn't matter to them if you paid your federal income taxes, but they want to know that you actually qualify. For the health insurance subsidies under Obamacare, you're actually required to file. And if we have had folks in our network who weren't filing, we're still getting the subsidies, but maybe 2 to 3 years after the fact, their state insurance, the people who ran the state insurance realized that they weren't filing on the federal level and they lost their subsidies. So that is something to keep in mind. For not filing, this essentially means you're not sending the IRS your forms, but we would recommend, if you do choose this method, please fill out the forms the year that you normally would, because if you do become collectible at some point, even though you might not think you are now, the IRS will perhaps at some point, if you are collectible, they'll file a tax. They'll file the tax forms for you, and they'll always do so that you owe more than you perhaps really do. They're not going to take the time to make sure you get all the deductions that you should. So if you do become collectible, you want to be able to dispute the amount that's being collected. It does make it harder. Like, for instance, if you're self-employed, and even if you are doing work that's being reported to the IRS might know what your total income is, but they wouldn't know what your deductions are and what you actually owe. And so to file a tax form on your behalf it's another step of the process that makes it more difficult. It says there's no statute of limitations, but as should be clear, the statute of limitations essentially won't start until the IRS files your tax forms for you. So that could be in a year, or that could be in 8 years. So there's definitely an uncertainty there. And there's also an additional penalty. So it's if someone refuses to file and they decide to follow up on that, there's a penalty of 5% a month, up to 25% of the tax owed. So essentially that whole penalty will come into play within about 5 months. So it's a penalty that they put there to also to dissuade people from filing late. So now some myths about war tax resistance. So I'm going to go through kind of the myths and then what will likely actually happen. So the first myth is I will go to jail. And I think this is just ingrained in us. I was speaking at a college a couple weeks ago, and during the 75-minute class time, and I was sharing some about war tax resistance and some about other things, but maybe like 3 different times a student just asked, why aren't you in jail? And I always had explained each time, but I think it just didn't stick. It didn't sound believable, but it is ingrained in us that this is what would happen. But so just to be clear, according to the law, someone can actually go to jail simply for refusing to pay. But when it comes to war tax resistors, this has only happened twice since World War II. The first is with one of our modern day founders of war tax resistance, Ernest Bromley, in 1942. He was sentenced to 2 months for refusing to buy a war stamp for his car. Since then, it's only happened one time in 2005 with Tony Serra, and this is called willful failure to pay. And I think his special situation is that he's a lawyer. So when the IRS, in the rare instance that they actually criminally prosecute for this, they need to prove that the person understood exactly what they were doing. And in the case of a lawyer, that's something that's much easier to do. So I would give that as a word of warning, if there are any lawyers watching, to this is something that you definitely want to consider. You would be at a greater risk because the expectations of you for understanding what laws you're breaking, you'd be held to a higher standard. Other myths about war tax. Oh, sorry, let me go back one moment. So also when it comes to jail, I can say that over the past 25 to 30 years, there have been some other war tax resistors that have gone to jail for short periods of time, but in each case, it's because they filed inaccurate, or another way to put it is fraudulent forms. So if you are a filer and you actually lie on your tax forms, that's something that the IRS, with its limited resources, will use those limited resources to criminally prosecute if they catch you doing this. So, but for people who have, either not filed or filed honestly, in the last 30 years, there isn't any case of a war tax resistor going to jail. It's usually what we call the civil arm, not the criminal arm of the IRS, that is active in trying to collect the funds. So another myth about war tax resistance, the IRS will take my house or car or property. So if you happen to come in touch with someone who was a war tax resistor during the 70s, 80s, or up to about 1997, there's a good chance that they might have a story of the IRS taking a car, and in some instances taking a home. Taking homes wasn't very common, but it happened often enough that people knew someone that it happened to. But we see that the IRS in the late 90s had a change in philosophy. I think they had been perhaps over aggressive with the general public in taking property. And so a change was to really cut back on this, except for cases usually of people with extreme wealth who are cheating the tax system, so to speak. So we can see that up until 1997, it was common for at least 10,000 pieces of property to be taken by the IRS each year. So, that could be cars, homes, any number of things, boats. Since then, it's been usually anywhere between about 100 and 400 items, and we haven't known of a single person in our network since 1999 who's had any piece of property taken by the IRS. It's just not something they do much of anymore. But again, that's one of those things that could change, but we don't see that changing in the foreseeable future. Another myth about war tax resistance, the IRS will just get the money in the end, and then when you add in perhaps some interest and penalties, they'll get more. So this is some information from the IRS itself that they shared. And as you can see here, this came out maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and then it was for about 5 years before that. So unfortunately, the information isn't as new as I'd like it to be, but it's the latest that the IRS has released. So we can see that going back to, almost a decade ago from when they had this information compiled, they knew that year they were that there was $2.5 trillion owed in federal income taxes, or I should say federal taxes. That includes individual, corporate, employment, etc. Then there's what they call the tax gap. So there's what's actually paid and then the part that's not paid. So the part that's not paid is close to $500 billion, $458 billion. So probably now that's much greater. The tax gap has grown, but these are the numbers they shared then. And at that point, they stated that they estimated that of that $458 billion, that 406 billion would never be collected. So that's the vast majority. The vast majority of the funds that aren't paid on a yearly basis, they believe they will never collect. And so that's one reason the IRS is always asking to have more funds and better funding. It is partially because of their funding, which has been just cut and cut and cut over the last 2 decades, that has led to them being less effective in collecting funds. I think this is perhaps our last myth about war tax resistance, that, we're not paying for things in society that are needed. We're just trying to skirt the system. And so people who are refusing to pay, we have this practice then of redirecting funds to people and groups that are in great need or, are underfunded. So, and there are certain groups, like there's what we call war tax resistance alternative funds. The 2 major ones, one's in New England and one is in the Bay Area in California. And they'll actually pool their funds and do granting ceremonies each year. So, but other war tax resistors will, donate on their own. And oftentimes they'll report it to the Nutric office. In one of our following newsletters, I'll make a report of some of the things that people donated to. So it's just wanting to redirect to those things. We're not trying to skirt an obligation to our fellow person or our common ground, common earth. So what are the actual risks then? So the thing that, especially if one files, will happen is you'll get a stream of letters from the IRS. I can say that for myself, every year I am a filer, so every year I'll get a letter for each year I haven't paid the past 10 years. And then they'll also send one to my spouse. So there'll be a day, usually in the middle of the summer, where I'll get 20 letters from the IRS. And just that fear of the IRS that's ingrained in us, even though I know they're just probably just all computer generated, I open them all to make sure, but usually they're just stating, hey, you owe. But my heart still usually skips a beat. And but these letters are very effective. The IRS has stated that when it comes to getting people to pay who have a tax debt, 50% of overdue taxes that they collect are paid simply because they sent letters out. So these computer generated letters are very effective in instilling fear. So you'll get that for sure if you're a filer. There is salary garnishments, especially if you're a wage employee. I have often referred to it as the reverse lottery. Because of the IRS being so underfunded, there are millions of people that they don't send wage garnishments to every year that they could. And so I'll usually only hear from 1 or 2 folks in our network every year who have actually received a wage garnishment. But the IRS has stated they only send out as many wage garnishments as they have people to answer the phone to answer questions for employers, because there's so many scams that employers are wary of complying unless they know it's really from the IRS. So they'll only send out as many as they can handle phone calls for. What's more common is a Social Security garnishment. If someone has a tax debt and begins collecting Social Security, with that being just another federal agency, they can collect 15%. And so that is something that is very common, perhaps the most common way that the IRS at least gets some of that money back. There's bank seizures. Again, this is not very common. Some war tax resistors, to try, even though it's not common, but just to try to avoid it altogether, will make sure that they don't have funds in an interest-bearing account, because if you earn more than $10 of interest during the year, it'll get reported to the IRS and you should also get a form. But if you don't have $10 of interest, then it won't be reported to the IRS, and it'll be very difficult for them to find that money or know where it is. I should also state, if you're self-employed, they could send what they call a levy if they know who one of the companies that you work for, if they know who they are. But with a wage garnishment, if you're an employee, they can essentially put a garnishment on your wages that you'll owe until the tax is paid off. If you're self-employed, it works a little differently. It's actually to your advantage. The moment that your company that you do contract work for, the moment that they open the letter, if they owe you money, they can take money out of what they owe you up to the whole amount. So I guess this is the disadvantage. They could possibly take everything if your tax debt is that great, but then it's a one-time thing. If they had just paid you the day before, and they don't owe you anything, then they'll tell the IRS we didn't owe them anything at this time. And it doesn't matter if you do work for them again the next day. It just is, did they catch the company owing you money at the moment that they opened the letter? So they'd have to send multiple letters over a period of time to try to get all of the money if you had a greater tax debt. And I should say, with a wage garnishment, they do need to leave you with take-home pay. Right now, that's around $1,100 a month for $1,100 to $1,200 a month for a single person. It's double that for a married couple, and then if you have kids, it increases. But that's take home. So after Social Security and Medicare are taken out, if you have money for healthcare taken out, if you have, and even money for retirement, even if it's voluntary money for retirement, like a 401k, anything that's involuntarily or voluntarily removed from your paycheck before you receive it, that doesn't count as your take home. They need to leave you take home of $1,100 if you're a single individual to around $2,200, $2,300 if you're married. So for some folks, depending on what they're used to living on, that might be, oh, that's not too big a hit. And for other folks, that might be a major hit. So it's something to keep in mind. State refunds can be seized if you accidentally overpay to the state. That has happened to me a couple times early on as a war tax resistor when I paid too much into the state and wasn't thinking about how the IRS might send a letter, which they had. So it was just redirected to them. There are interest and penalties, which more come into play if you actually are collectible. So normally the interest for refusing to pay a tax debt, or I should say the penalty is 0.5% a month up to 25% of your tax debt. Then there's interest on top of that. Right now it's about 4% a year. So essentially, if you had filed and you have the 10-year statute of limitations, by the time you hit that 10-year mark, with the interest and penalties, your tax debt would probably almost double. So just so people that is the situation. If you would be collectible, they would take up to double if they happen to collect right at the end. Loss of healthcare subsidies, which I had mentioned previously, difficulty in getting student loans. If someone has a tax debt of around $20,000, the IRS does pretty regularly send a notice of a public lien to the local county courthouse. They'll also send one to you, letting you know that they've done so. The main effect of this public lien is if you would sell something such as your house, something where the process of the transaction would include the courthouse. If you sold your home, and let's say you're selling your home for $200,000, but you had a $20,000 tax debt, at that point, the IRS would collect, because when the banks were doing their due diligence and the realtors, they would say, oh, there's this tax debt, and that money would be removed and sent to the IRS before you received it. This can also, sometimes with this notice of a public lien, it sometimes affects credit. I haven't heard of it affecting anyone's credit recently. I have a public lien, and the last time I checked my credit a few months ago, I think it was still around like 740. So it's never affected my credit, and most people I know it hasn't. But in years past, I think when the IRS had more employees, they're more diligent about that, and that could change in the future if people, are concerned about their credit. There's also at least the loss of the ability to renew one's passport. This went into play in 2018, that if someone has a tax debt of what they consider a large tax debt. It goes up with inflation about $1,000 a year. But this year, if someone has a tax debt of around $59,000, they won't be able, to renew their passport. They could still get a new passport. I'm sorry. The passport that they currently have would still be fine, but once it expires, they wouldn't be able to renew their passport unless they signed up for a payment plan with the IRS. So for people who either love to travel or, maybe have to travel for work, this would be something to keep in mind when it comes to their tax debt. Other actual risks, some you may have heard, the IRS not too long ago was given, or a bill was put in place to fund the IRS an additional $80 billion over 10 years. Thus far, they've gotten some of that money, and it allowed them to take care of their backlog of paper 1040s that they hadn't processed. And this is a picture of one of the rooms where they were way behind. They're now caught up with some of this money. They've caught up on those. But some of the compromises to extend the debt limit that have happened recently have kind of gutted the amount of money the IRS would be receiving. So a large part of will the IRS get most of this $80 billion will depend on who's elected president next. If a Republican comes into the presidency at the next election, the IRS will probably see all of this money lost. But if it does actually happen, it will increase their budget by 60%. It'll double their workforce. They expect it to increase collection because they can put more focus on that. But essentially, it'll just increase their funding level to what it was 10 years ago. And they weren't that great 10 years ago. Now, they really haven't been great at collecting in an organized and systematical fashion since the 90s. So, so on a practical level, I'd probably, maybe instead of 2 people a year, maybe that number would double of people I hear getting garnishments or levies of some sort. But so that's, still in play. So that's just kind of some very basics about war tax resistance. But I want to let you know, we do have these resources, our website. Everything's available for free. We're an organization that just runs on donations. So if this has been helpful, or you start looking through the website and you find it helpful, I'd encourage you to make whatever donation is appropriate. But again, all of our resources that we create are available for free on the website, and that's what we're here for. We have a newsletter that comes out every other month, a blog. All these things can be found on the website. Tax day activities, which we'll collect and promote on the website, gatherings, all those sorts of things. And we also have war tax resistance counselors listed by state on the website. And so these are folks, they're just volunteers who are war tax resistors who have gone through some extra training so that they can be more aware of not just their situation, but how if you're, maybe they're employed, but you're self-employed. And so they have gone through some training so that they can deal with someone who's not just a carbon copy of them, share their experience and wisdom, and help you figure out what's you're comfortable with and what's best for you. They're not there to try to convince you to do anything, just to be a resource. So please feel free to make use of those folks. And here's a list of, again, just I'll make sure to put this list after this video goes up on our YouTube channel. I'll put it in the description. But otherwise, our website, there's the W4 link, a link to the counselor list to sign up for the newsletter. And then lastly, just to touch base, they're not part of NUTRIC, but a sister organization called the War Tax Resistance Penalty Fund. And they were started a number of years ago as kind of a mutual aid group. So they started when collection was much more common. So when collection was much more common, they would at least help. They'd kind of pass the hat, so to speak. You get a quarterly, now an email from them stating, oh, this, if someone was collected on, if everyone pitched in $15, we could at least reimburse them for penalties and interest. So they're not there to reimburse the actual tax that was collected, but if someone's taken a bigger hit because of the interest and penalties, they're there to help out with the reimbursement of that. So at least that doesn't injure someone's ability to survive. So let me stop the screen share. So, Chrissy, how are we looking with comments or questions?
Yeah, there's been a few that have come through, and some have kind of been crowdsourced or answered in the chat, but would definitely welcome people to add additional questions. There was one about how common are garnishments, and also what is the role of the employers in that process? Like, do they anything beyond placing the levy?
Yeah, so with a wage garnishment, again, they're not very common, and especially since COVID, they almost disappeared. The IRS is still just trying to get back to business still. But when it does happen, they'll send your employer a letter, and then the employer will give you, I forget, either a copy of the letter or there's something that they'll be sent, that they'll be given by the IRS to give you. And I believe that letter will essentially say you have, I want to say it's 3 days to kind of dispute how much should be taken. And part of that is just verifying, like maybe your employer or the IRS doesn't have a correct understanding if you're married, because generally the IRS might send that letter and just say, we only want you to allow them $1,100 of take-home pay. But if you're married and have 2 kids, like that'll show up in the letter. You'll see, is the information accurate of how they want to readjust based on your living situation? And so you want to make sure you read that letter and, if possible, dispute certain things if the IRS is being inaccurate. But when it comes to your employer's role in this, if they refuse to withhold those funds and send them to the IRS, they actually become 100% liable for those funds. So if essentially that means employers almost always participate. Although I will say I have heard from war tax resistors over the years where the employer, trying to kind of walk the line, if there was a supportive employer, they sometimes sent a letter. There's a story I know of where an employer sent a letter stating, I feel real uncomfortable doing this. I think what they're doing is for a good cause and a good reason. Do I have to do this? Asking for clarification, and never hearing from the IRS. And kind of that one letter was enough to like grind the wheels of the IRS to a halt. But part of that, that was an instance where there was an employer who was supportive. Normally, you might not want to let your employer know that you're a war tax resistor. They are technically under a legal obligation if they know that you are falsifying your W-4 form to report that to the IRS. I've never heard of an employer actually being prosecuted or punished in any way for having previous knowledge of that, but you are potentially putting your employer in a strange situation if you let them know why you're refiling your W-4, instead of just saying something like, my situation has changed and I wanted to refile a new W-4 form.
Yeah, some other questions. There were quite a few about the W-4, kind of some of the specifics about it, but there was also a question about e-payments and if that gets reported to the IRS, like through different apps.
Oh, yeah. So let me write. What was the first part?
I'm sorry, I'm going to gather some of the ones on the W-4 and kind of pull them together, but that was one.
The W-4. So again, I would say check out those resources, but just as a very simple, for instance, if you're a single individual, at the top, so not married, at the top, you'll check a box on the W-4 that states that you're single. Since the standard deduction is $13,000 and your employer's computer will know that, just by marking that box, the computer will say, well, whatever their income is, I'm going to deduct the $13,000 standard deduction that they'll take when they fill out their taxes at the end of the year. So let's say the computer also knows what your income will be because they're the ones that pay you. And so let's say your income for the year is $20,000. And again, and this is what it would be based on the whole year. Even if you're only going to be working someplace for 6 months, the computer isn't that smart. You have to say, what am I paid each paycheck? And based on that paycheck, if that's what I get every week, how much do I make for the whole year? The computer's always going to think that way, even if you're not working there for the whole year. So but let's just say, for the whole year, if you were working there, you would make $20,000. You marked single, so that's a standard deduction of $13,000. So the computer believes that you'll have taxable income of $7,000. 20,000 minus 13,000, $7,000 of taxable income. So if on line 4B for deductions, you wrote in $7,000, now the computer will say, well, I already know you're getting paid 20, your standard deduction is 13. You said you're going to have additional deductions on line 4B of 7,000, and it'll zero out what the computer believes is your taxable income and say no money should be removed because we don't believe you're going to owe any income taxes. So I hope that's just kind of a very quick example, but those resources kind of show you on the form how to do those things. With the e-payments, I'm assuming they're referring to things like PayPal, Venmo.
If I could just ask,
Sure.
but to clarify, the apps that let you transfer money to others when cash isn't an option.
Yeah, so I think that'd be like Cash App, Venmo, PayPal. If you're transferring between friends, essentially, I think the greatest hint is if you transfer money and no money's taken out for a fee, usually that's a friend transfer and that isn't reported to the IRS. But if you're doing kind of an official work transfer, if you're a massage therapist and someone's paying you by Venmo and they're paying you, I don't know, through your website, and if there's a fee charged, that's a tip to Venmo that this is a business transaction, not something just between friends who are reimbursing each other for something. And actually, it seemed like there was going to be a new law going into effect this year that if you're going to receive more than $600 in these business type of transactions, then that company, PayPal, Venmo, whoever, would report it to the IRS. Actually, the IRS just came out maybe 1 or 2 days ago stating that they're going to delay implementation. So they did that last year too. It was like in December that they delayed implementation. So this law was supposed to go into effect for last tax year, and then they delayed it now, and now they're delaying it again. So for this year, my understanding at this exact moment is we're still under the old system. Under the old system, unless you have business transactions of more than 200 and money coming to you in business transactions of over $20,000, so it's the 200 transactions, $20,000 rule. Unless you meet both of those criteria, those companies like PayPal or Venmo are not supposed to report it to the IRS, or at least I should say they don't have to. Because of the confusion, they still might. There's no law saying they can't report it. And in fact, I know someone that received a PayPal 1099K last year for this very reason. PayPal didn't have to send it to them, but I think in the confusion they just did. But for this year, it's not supposed to happen unless you meet the 200 transactions, $20,000 rule. And then the IRS press release said that for tax year 2024, they're going to try to slowly implement it and instead of going right to the $600 rule, next year it'll be if you have business transactions of $5,000 or more. And then the year after that, it would finally go down to 600. I think the IRS is trying to delay this because before the government almost shut down and the House didn't have a speaker and all that stuff happened, there was actually a bipartisan bill to kind of readjust this $600 rule from being implemented this year. And then I think they got so far behind with business because they didn't have a speaker in the House that this bill isn't going anywhere right now. And so the IRS, I guess, feels they have the leeway to slowly implement it with the hope that the Congress will come up with some compromise, because no banks and PayPal and Venmo, they don't want to deal with the $600 rule because it would result in so much extra paperwork and accounting on their end.
There was a question about the risk of sending a letter to the IRS. No.
Sure.
Maybe mention for this coming tax season, the form that we were going to modify.
Oh yeah. So there is, I mean, some people send their own form to the IRS. We do have what we call a peace tax return. So if you like Googled our acronym NUTRIC and peace tax return, you'd see our current version come up, but we're going to put an updated version up in the next month or so. But it's kind of like a pre-written letter that you could send with your tax forms or send to your congressional representatives or both. Or if you're an e-filer, you could just, send it to the IRS commissioner. It has the address for them there. But sending a letter doesn't seem to have any greater impact in whether someone, as I refer to it as this reverse lottery, if you happen to be chosen, one of the unlucky chosen ones for a wage garnishment, whether you send a letter or not doesn't seem to matter. I think, they have certain IRS employees that open up the paper returns and just put everything where it's supposed to go. And it doesn't seem that it matters that much. But I will say there was an instance in the mid 2000s till around 2010 or so where people who sent in letters were threatened with what they call a frivolous fine of $5,000. And some of them actually had the money removed from them. But we, thankfully, with that, one of the reasons NUTRIC is here is when things like this happen that aren't supposed to happen. We were, it's hard to find the right person at the IRS, but my predecessor at the time tracked down who handled kind of quality control at the IRS and explained that this wasn't an instance of the frivolous fine. The frivolous fine of $5,000 is only supposed to be imposed if you are doing something to your tax form itself that's inappropriate. For instance, if you wanted to say, oh, for each child killed in this war, I want to mark them as a dependent on my tax return and take that as a deduction. It's not a legal deduction. And for that, you could receive the $5,000 frivolous fine. But just sending a letter, there's not any fine associated with that. And well, like I said, that was the one instance going back now, 13 years where some people who sent letters were hassled by, it appears, some low-level IRS agents that wanted to hassle them, but then were set right. And the few who had money taken had their money returned. So, but right now there doesn't seem to be any issue with that. Oh, you're muted.
Thanks. It seems like there's a few other follow-up questions about specifics about the money transfers, and if Zelle is also considered part of that, PayPal and Venmo.
Yeah, all of those would be in the same boat together. So I forget if it's Zelle or Zelly or, but any of those where you transfer, funds, all of them fall under this rule, which, like I said, got delayed. It was going to be $600 this year, but now it's back to the $20,000 rule. And next year it's going to be $5,000. So I know that there are folks in our network who are self-employed, and there is someone who comes to mind who works as a massage therapist and mainly gets paid through these online apps. So in the past they've been a non-filer and weren't concerned, thought the IRS essentially wouldn't find them. But if this, especially even with the drop to $5,000 for 2024, now they might be more on the IRS's radar since they haven't been filing a tax return.
There also were kind of some questions specifically about, people filing married with dependents, and also about self-employment, as well as working with organizations and how to support people doing more tax resistance. And I did share some of the practicals in the chat, but maybe it might be a good resource.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just to touch on the marriage question first, and obviously if someone is married or is going to be getting married, this is a serious conversation to have, because the person that you might be marrying will either be on board or not on board or somewhere in between. And when it comes to things like property and just, right now the IRS hasn't taken a war tax resistor's home in nearly 30 years because of that change in policy. But, in one sense, you might not want to leave that door open. You might want to protect yourself from that just in case the IRS changes their policy. And so in many states, especially if one spouse is a war tax resistor and the other is not a war tax resistor, if you file separately, then the one who owes the tax debt is the only one who owes the tax debt, and items like the family's car and home could be in the spouse's name who pays their income taxes. Hopefully not a lot, but if they pay, then just have it in that spouse's name. That's where the difficulty for many folks who did that, there was the difficulty when Obamacare came into play, because if they also hope to receive those benefits, those subsidies, to receive Obamacare subsidies, not only do you have to file your federal income taxes, but if you're married, you have to file jointly. So that way there's no, you need to, unfortunately, the other spouse will have to take on that debt if you want to get the subsidies. The other part of that, though, is what I said about filing separately to kind of keep the tax debt separate. It doesn't work in all states. Let me just pull up, what's the term I'm trying to think of? Community property states. So there are 9 community property states that if you live in those states, it doesn't matter if you file separately. And actually, I'm in one of them. So when I was having the conversation with my spouse, or, at the time, soon to be spouse, filing separately wasn't an option. Because if you are in Arizona, California, Idaho, Louisiana, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Washington, or Wisconsin, those are community property states. And in those states, any assets and any debt that is acquired by either spouse after they are married belongs to both of them. So this law was initially put into place in those states in order that, if you had one spouse who was working and one spouse who's maybe home taking care of the kids and they got divorced, the one who hadn't been working at least has the right to 50% of everything that was made during the marriage. But if you're thinking of being a war tax resistor, it also means even if you file separately, the debt would fall to them also. So it is more complicated, so to speak, in those states about how people want to handle it if one spouse is less keen about war tax resistance.
There's also some questions about if asking for taxes not to go to war expenses really works, and also kind of more general questions about the impact of war tax resistance, if we've seen any results or have any data.
Sure. I'm sorry. Maybe you could rephrase the first question for me?
Oh, it was if writing a letter has any impact, and also people asking if others in the Newtrick network share letters publicly.
Yeah, so maybe I'll take one step back just to finish with the marriage question. Some, like Chrissy's been sharing some practicals. We do have a practical that's on relationships. And so like what I covered there and even stuff about the community property states, all of that is in there. Everything, basically everything I've talked about tonight is on the website, but I know because this is so much information, sometimes it can be hard to find on the website or to know what you're looking for. And so that's one reason we do these introduction to war tax resistance sessions, so that you can kind of get an idea of what is my situation, what am I, and what do I want to try to find. So hopefully that way you can try to know what you're looking for on the website. People do share letters. I don't know if the letters have any effect. I don't think an IRS agent would ever share that, oh, I opened this letter and it really affected me, or it's just hard to say. But it is also at least leaving a trail if for some reason you did have a situation where the IRS had a change of attitude and decided to start criminally prosecuting some people, to have in your file, for a potential court case, things that are stating that show that this is a legitimate concern of yours that comes from a place of not just trying to skirt the law, couldn't hurt. The results of war tax resistance, that is harder to measure. Where it's easier to measure the results is with the redirection. There are, even if someone over the course of a number of years, let's say, resisted $100,000, $100,000 pays for maybe part of a wing on a fighter jet. It's in one sense relatively small, but if someone has been redirecting that $100,000 to groups and organizations that are in great need and underfunded, I think it'd be quite obvious that that would mean a substantial boon for those groups and be very helpful. And I think that's where we see the greater immediate impact. We do know that the IRS was definitely concerned about war tax resistance during the Vietnam War. That's probably where war tax resistance reached its height during the past century in the United States. And if you're familiar, if you go to the library and still see like the old 1040 form booklets in paper form, though you can download them online also. On the first couple pages, you'll see a pie chart where the IRS says where all the money is going. And one of the big parts of that pie chart now that makes the amounts for war look smaller is that they, during the Vietnam War, began including Medicare and Social Security on that pie chart. Up until the Vietnam War, the IRS viewed those as separate. And so we view them as separate also. They're kind of trust funds that you pay them, they go to a directed fund, and then they go out for Social Security and Medicare. That's how the IRS treated them, and that's how they portrayed them. But as the Vietnam War intensified, people could see when they're doing their taxes at home and opening up that booklet that almost half of their federal income taxes were going for war. And it actually led to a great increase in war tax resistance during that time. And that's why they made the decision to change how they portray the pie chart so that they could shrink the war portion and hopefully dissuade people from practicing war tax resistance. So again, it's one of those things, it's hard to say. The federal government is usually not going to say that some protest or, swayed them in a direction especially while it's happening, but sometimes we can measure some of these things after the fact.
There's a lot of specific questions, but there's also been some more general questions about how much information to share with accountants and how forthcoming. Also inquiries if Newtrick has a list of sympathetic accountants.
Sure. Yeah, good question. as someone who, yeah, received his undergraduate in accounting, um, my my understanding of at that time, and probably I'm sure it's the same now, most of the people I graduated with would be not very sympathetic. um, and I'd also say they would probably assume the same fallacies that most people believe that, oh, if you don't do this, you're going to go to jail. If you don't pay this, during an accounting education, it's all about learning how to, maximize deductions, or it's about bookkeeping in this way. Like there never was a class on what will the IRS actually do if you have a client who refuses to pay. Like that's never covered. So in that sense, an accountant would not be a resource for helping you know what the IRS would do. I mean, I don't think any accounting program even covers what the law states would happen if you refuse to pay. It's just the assumption is you're an accountant and you're there to tell people what they owe, and the assumption is they're going to pay it. So depends on what sort of relationship you have with an accountant. I don't know if you'd want to share with them or not. That I'd leave that up to your read on them as a person. But I will say I don't think it matters if you have a sympathetic accountant or not. Their main purpose is to minimize your taxes, and they'd be the perfect person to talk to if you're like, if I wanted to lower my taxes, what are certain things that I could do when it comes to work or retirement or such and such. Like they receive those questions all the time from people who aren't war tax resistors. So they're used to receiving those types of questions, and they're more qualified than almost anyone to give those answers. Where NUTRIC has a special role, the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, is that we're not here to tell you how to keep your taxes low, because there's a whole group of people called accountants that do that. But we're here to let you know, based on our experience, what the law is and then what's most likely to happen. And if something happened, to help you out with some mutual aid, shared wisdom, or any other way that we can possibly help out to be a resource and support for people who are practicing war tax resistance. So.
There was a question if there's been a history of race or other discrimination in collection, like specifically targeting a demographic of resistors.
It's hard to say. The short answer is yes. When it comes to war tax resistance, the short answer is I don't know, and I'll expand briefly on both of those. We know when it comes to things like audits. Well, first I'll say the IRS doesn't collect race data. You might remember, if you think back to every time you filed a tax form, it never asks what your race is. The IRS believes that it is colorblind, and in its colorblindness, it is just towards all. But it's not true. There have been studies done recently that show when it comes to things like audits, I mean, this is something that everyone's known for quite a while, that poor people, because they're easier to audit and have less resources to dispute an audit or its findings, particularly those who take the earned income tax credit, they're more likely to be audited. But we also know that I believe it's twice the rate of Black Americans are audited for the earned income tax credit than white Americans. And partially because the IRS doesn't collect race data, and they also don't share how they flag people for things like audits. We don't know, since they're not collecting race data, how are they auditing twice the amount of Black individuals in the United States compared to white individuals for the earned income tax credit. We don't know. But I will say, when it comes to a war tax resistance, we haven't, I'd say the sample size is too small, but from those folks of different racial backgrounds within our movement, we haven't noticed anyone being specifically picked on, so to speak, or targeted because of their race. But again, where the IRS needs to do more studies is if once someone is chosen for, let's say, criminal prosecution, are they choosing more people of a certain race? Like once a person actually comes into play and it gets beyond the bounds of the computer flagging. So it's a good question. Unfortunately, we just don't have enough information at this time to really say, and the IRS hasn't been very cooperative.
There's also been some questions about if you file over TurboTax, are there ways to integrate more tax resistance? Also looking for alternatives to TurboTax. And yeah.
Yeah. I've not filed with TurboTax, but my understanding from people who do is you don't have to pay. I believe there's an option where you can say you're going to send in a check separately. The other option could be that you could, I don't know how this works with TurboTax, but if you were going to a place like H&R Block, for instance, that might want to just file on your behalf, or your regular accountant might want to file on your behalf electronically, you can just say, I want to please print those out. I want to mail them in. They'll probably look at you very strange, but because they can't believe anyone would want to do that. But that's another option. But my understanding is if you file electronically, you should be able to check an option that you'd send in a payment later, and at that point you could choose to send in a letter instead, if you wanted to. There was something else I was thinking of with that, but I'll leave it there.
Or maybe I can just add to it too. In the past, that Newtrick has kind of encouraged people to file paper forms as just kind of one way of also slowing the process down, or having a little bit more leverage, or just that it takes more people on the end of the IRS to complete that.
Thank you. That's exactly what I was trying to remember. I think to process an e-return takes them like, I don't know, it's either 4 seconds or maybe even less, a fourth of a second. It's something like that. But to process a paper return, takes a few minutes. Someone has to put it in the machine, and it gets, it's a much longer process. So filing a paper return does kind of gum up the works substantially for the IRS.
Yeah, there was also a question about with increased interest in war tax resistance, with what the situation happening in Gaza and elsewhere in the world with our tax money. Does it seem like the IRS will take more interest in people doing war tax resistance?
It's hard to say. It's very possible. Again, this is where, if you're going to set yourself up to practice war tax resistance, let's say on April 15th, if the IRS does decide with their limited resources to try to target some war tax resistors, maybe before April 15th rolls around, you'd see those who have been doing it for years, telling stories that something has happened to them. So at least you'd know. And that's one reason Newtrick is around. When we have our newsletter that goes out every other month, before I had my current position as the coordinator, the first thing I do, and I got the paper version, but you can also just read it online. But in the paper version, page 2 of the newsletter has a section called Counselor's Notes. And that's where, all these questions that we had about e-payments through, Zelle and Cash App and all that. I've been putting regular updates about that so that everyone in our network knows what the current state of that law is, which has been in flux for the last 2 to 3 years. But also, if someone does receive a wage garnishment, people contact the office. And so I'll put regular updates so that people know, what's happening, how often it's happening, is there an increase? And so that's one other reason that Newtrick is around, to help folks out with that. So again, part of it, I think, will depend, is this interest in war tax resistance, does it end up being sustained, or, will people lose interest by the time tax day rolls around? If it ends up being sustained, perhaps we will see the IRS focusing more on wage garnishments and those types of things, but it's hard to say.
There was another question that my spouse and I are officers and employees of an S corporation. I do payroll and make monthly withholding deposits. Is there a good resistance method for someone like me?
I mean, I would officers. I guess I'm unclear if they're employees, then they could still do the same thing that anyone else would do with refiling their W-4. The thing that'll put them in a weird position is, let's say 2 years from now, the IRS sends a garnishment. They might be the ones who open it up and then have to garnish their own wages on behalf of their employer, because I'm sure their employer will say, well, you need to garnish your wages and you need to make sure you send that check into the IRS. Because I have been a bookkeeper before and kind of was in a similar position. I wasn't garnished though, but at the time I remember I did receive a garnishment for someone who, I think it was for one of their kids. Like they were they had co-signed on their children, one of their child's student loans, and their child was behind on payments, and now their wages were getting garnished. So it's kind of strange to be in that position where it's actually the same amount of take home and all that. It's the same formula for student loan garnishments that it is for as it is for tax resistance.
There was another question. We rarely owe taxes at the end of the year, generally get a refund. Does adjusting your W-4 so less tax is taken out of our paycheck in the first place the best thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and if you adjusted it so that at least you didn't get a refund, that's perfectly legal. In fact, that's what the IRS wants to happen. They want people to be filling out their W-4s in such a way that they're putting down their anticipated deductions accurately so that they neither owe nor get a refund. So that'd be perfectly legal, and at least you wouldn't be giving the IRS a free refund, an interest-free refund all year. But depending, you could also lower it so that your withholding is zero, and then by the time, it sounds like in your situation, even if you lowered your withholding to zero, you might just either lower your refund or negate your refund, and you'd at least get rid of that for this year. And then next year, you'd maybe have a decision to make about whether you wanted to resist your taxes that are due, in April of 2025. So that is the other part that this, it's not like an immediate action with an immediate response. And so for some people, that's nice. There's usually never an emergency with war tax resistance. It's a slow process, but for some people that can also be irksome, that it's always like, you might always get a letter, or you could be the one who's garnished. It's always there as a possibility.
There was another one. How do you take into account low-income people who get the earned income credit and child tax credit as a refund? Do those get taken if you refuse to pay?
I mean, if those are things that you qualify for anyways, chances are you don't owe any income taxes, and maybe you get more money. Like maybe money's being taken out of your check because your W-4 is filled out incorrectly. So if you filled out your W-4 correctly, probably with being low income, a correctly filled out W-4 would result in no federal income taxes being removed. So, at the end of the year when you file, you'd still get your earned income tax credit and those other items, but and so it'd be a smaller amount, but it would mean that then the rest of the year you got to get directly those funds instead of giving them as a free loan. So again, that would be just an instance of you don't owe, which is the legal way to do it, and just adjusting your W-4 so you're not giving them a free loan. But that would be completely legal if I'm understanding the situation correctly. Here, maybe while you're looking, maybe we'll take one or two more questions, but there is one more example that I think is important that popped into my mind. Another thing that makes war tax resistance different than other things. So I'll, instead of comparing this to like a protest, or I'll compare it to something that most people would probably frown upon. Like if tomorrow I decided to go out and rob a bank. So, people might view that differently depending on how they view banks. But I would say a credit union. I went out and robbed a credit union, and and I essentially looks like I got away with it, and I'm home with the cash, and a week later I decide, oh, I really didn't want to do that, and I go back to the credit union and I return the money. It doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter that I return the money. Like maybe instead of getting like a 30-year sentence, they're like, well, he brought back the money and we didn't know who he was. Like maybe they'll give me a shorter sentence, but I'm going to jail for sure. There's no doubt about it. But with war tax resistance, even if someone is practicing this illegal method, because the IRS, at least at this point and for the last few decades, hasn't wanted to criminally prosecute war tax resistors because unless they practiced fraud. But those who don't practice fraud, they viewed them as sympathetic and they didn't want to criminally prosecute them, and they haven't been doing it. So in those cases, the IRS is just using their civil arm and really is just trying to get the money. But let's say the IRS does change their protocols and you happen to be a person that they're going to try to take your home. At that point, if you felt like this is just too uncomfortable for me, or my spouse doesn't want to deal with this and I want to be supportive, you could start a payment plan, and basically all those kind of bad things that the IRS is threatening, they're all going to stop. So it's, in that sense, that's what I would say makes it different than, let's say, robbing a bank or breaking other types of laws. That at the end of the day, the IRS just wants the money.
Great. I want to apologize if we didn't get to your question. I think that it is something that we can respond to on this link afterwards, or also feel free to reach out to Newtrick. Because some of the questions are kind of overall is just asking about the size of Newtrick, or just also realizing our statement about if there are millions of us, what can they do? Even if they decide to come down hard on us, this is where mutual aid and collective care come in. I don't recall hearing, but that Newtrick is in its 40th anniversary, and just like a really strong, solid network of people who are, have been practicing that mutual aid and collective care. To add that or highlight.
and I'll add, when it's hard to say how many folks there are, because I often only hear from people when they get that letter from the IRS that irks them. People often learn about war tax resistance from our website and do it on their own. Like when I became a war tax resistor in the late 90s, the web wasn't like it is now. And I was only able to become a war tax resistor by connecting with fellow war tax resistors in the Milwaukee area. And so making those connections, but now people can kind of do it on their own. But I can say that it's been very consistent the last few years that our website receives each year over 40,000 individual visitors, and each one of those visitors looks at an average of 90 pages on our website. I'm sorry, an average of 9 pages on our website. And so I hear that to say that's a lot of people who are very interested in checking out our website or resources and how it applies to them. I can also add that just during the month of November, in a given year, it's usually around 40,000, a little bit more. During the first 3 weeks of November, we've had 20,000 unique visitors to our website, which is normally what happens in half a year. So just to speak that this is something that there's a high interest in. And but yeah, please feel free on our, if you go to our website, and I'll put this into the description again later, but on our website, there's the About Us tab, and the last thing under the About Us tab is local contacts and counselors. And feel free to contact, if there's someone in your state, or if you're in a state that doesn't have one, just contact one who's in a nearby state. These are people who are very passionate about their war tax resistance and eager to talk to other people about it and hear what they're thinking about and help them make a decision. And the biggest issue I've heard from them over the past few years is I don't get that many phone calls or emails. Some of them I've heard they've been getting more this past month, but they're excited to hear from folks and to help them work through issues. So please make use of them, and then it helps build community with the people that are around you. I don't know, any final question that sticks out to you, Chrissy?
There's a few more like kind of more practical ones, but that maybe we can follow up on afterwards. I hate to just kind of open up a new topic, but yeah, support for hearing support about sharing this information. I just also want to express gratitude for everybody showing up and asking the questions and having interest.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we'll plan on doing this again. We'll put it up on our social media and everything when we're going to do it again, so that people can join in and we can answer more questions. And I did take one peek at the chat earlier, and I did notice a couple questions about audits. So I will just say war tax resistors are rarely audited, normally because most war tax resistors file accurately, and the IRS computer flags people for audits when they believe that something on their tax form, knowing their tax form and their occupation and the forms and blah, when they put all that together, if the computer believes that something doesn't smell right, they don't tell us. Again, the IRS doesn't share how they flag things. But when it comes to war tax resistors, since we usually file accurately, it's actually very rare whether someone's an employee or self-employed to be audited. So I just talked about audits before because I knew that that's something that a group had done to study the issue of the IRS and race recently. But for our folks, it's rarely an issue. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And it's been a pleasure. And we're very excited about this interest and hope to move forward together and meet new people and make new friends along the way. So happy that you're here, and we'll continue to be here. And thank you, Chrissy, for all your help.
Yeah, likewise, Lincoln.
All right, everyone. Well, again, we'll be around, but feel free to, put questions. I don't know if the chat will be saved, but after this video is uploaded to YouTube, there'll be a comment section. If we see comments there, we'll definitely follow up and try to answer as many comments as we can. So, all right, have